right, and last but not least, we have Dr. Erin Cortus from the University of Minnesota speaking. Erin is an associate professor and extension engineer in the Department of Bioproducts and Biosystems Engineering at the University of Minnesota. Her past and ongoing projects include measuring the air quality impacts of different manure management practices in swine, poultry, dairy, and beef cattle barns, biosecurity, and sustainability metrics. The broad mission of Dr. Cortus's program is to work with producers and communities to understand and continually improve the quality and productivity of livestock environments.
Is that better? There we go. Okay. Well, thank you. It's good to be here in front of all of you, both in person and online. We started this session from that perspective of the National Pork Board and how we move down this sustainability path together. Then we heard from Lauren on the Minnesota approach and how groups of farms within this specific region are moving forward. What I'm going to focus on today is more of a generic approach, or more of a generic view about how various approaches, how various perspectives influence our sustainability discussions. I don't work solely with pigs, I work across all livestock species. Sustainability is a topic amongst all of them. But when you dive into their programs, they all look a little bit different. Everyone is at a different stage. And so I think many of you probably find yourselves in that boat as well, where you're trying to navigate many different potential programs out there, but also be part of that process and how to advise as part of that process. I feel my role, and likely many of you as well, feel oftentimes in that role of a translator, translating between the science and then the application. That translation goes both ways, right? We need to translate from the science to the application, but then also from the application back to the science. Keep that transmission going both ways. And so what I want to focus on today is really how we can play a role in some of that communication. So within the sustainability realm, this is my interpretation of where things are at or where they're progressing. In my interpretation, from my perspective, as an extension specialist, I feel, and this has been reiterated a few times, that there is this consumer desire to feel good about their purchases. I think we all have that desire in the end, right? What that does, though, is it drives pressure on the supply chain to quantify product sustainability. In this arrow, there's a plus sign over the arrow. What that plus sign is meant to indicate in systems thinking language is that as the item to the left increases, so does this item to the right. There's a positive relationship there. With that pressure on the supply chain, then there are industry-led efforts to provide those sustainability metrics. We've just heard about some of those efforts. They require producer cooperation in reporting some of these sustainability metrics. And then what the goal is to reduce some of that pressure. This negative relationship here just means that it's a balancing loop. It's meant to counteract. Now, this works and this counteracts this pressure as long as it's fast enough. But if it's not fast enough, that pressure can continue to grow. And so where I think we have a role, or where I think agriculture has a role, is in building conversations about sustainability choices. And so by taking some of these metrics, by some of these actions that are going on farm, we can enhance our conversations, not just on a farm, but also those of us that are involved with advising farms in various capacities. We have a role in these conversations that ultimately can also help balance some of this pressure. And so this is what I use as my framework, or as the guide for my work. In order to enhance these conversations, and that's what today is about, is how do we enhance these conversations on all our parts? In order to enhance that, we need some common language. We need to understand what some of these terms are when we talk about sustainability, not just from the pork industry perspective, but just from the consumer perspective as well, or the sustainability science perspective. What are some of these terms? What is some of this language that is used? I also want to emphasize that critical conversations are not about necessarily agreeing. But critical conversations, a strong conversation is about enlightenment. And that's what the emphasis here is on. So my goal today is to focus on 3 aspects of sustainability to enhance our conversations. The first is that sustainability is a science. There's terminology, there's methods, there's approaches as part of that science, but it's also a practice. It's a bit of an art. It's also a set of beliefs, right? So that sustainability can be interpreted different ways. Sustainability impacts cross multiple spatial and temporal scales. And depending on perspective of what those impacts are or what the focus impact is, that changes the conversation. And so we need to recognize what that range is. And then sustainability perspectives are revealed through some of these deeper critical conversations. So the analogy that I'm going to use today is that it's a journey. Sustainability is a journey. I'm going to use this analogy to a road trip. Picture, if you will, a group of college students just finished their spring final exams. And they're embarking on a road trip for the summer. They have the summer. They know they have to be back in time for fall semester, but they really don't have a firm timeline or firm reservations, let's say, along the route. They have multiple paths that they could possibly go to get across the country and back in time for fall semester. But in general, it's really just flexible. I'm going to use this analogy to show how, the process and some of the science of sustainability is like embarking on a journey. And this applies to, or I think we can apply this to what we've heard from the national perspective, from the regional perspective, but I think you can see this also happening on farms or within individual organizations. Before leaving on a trip, there needs to be some buy-in, some consensus, an assessment of where you're at, and frankly, where you want to go. We heard from Lauren that in the spring, right, there was a decision to jump in to this effort. There needs to be this starting point. As part of this assessment, it's about understanding what are the resources available for your road trip. How much money, how much gas money, how much time, what vehicles do you have? Are they in good working order to make it across the country? Really, what are we starting with? In sustainability, in many of these sustainability plans, one of the first steps that we see done, or as part of one of those assessments, is a life cycle assessment. A life cycle assessment is a process model. It illustrates relationships and flows between different components of a system. Now, the diagram on the right is pretty complex, and I didn't mean for you to be able to read everything, but it's really about how do these different pieces of a system fit together, and how do resources flow through there, or how do emissions aggregate through this whole system. This is a science. There's a science to putting together these diagrams. There's a science to the relationships, and there's a science to the data gathering and the data use within these modeling. It is a model. Models are full of assumptions. It also requires a particular set of skills and training. Within these models, though, it's also important to recognize that there are scopes. There are boundaries. This picture here is what we would call a cradle-to-plate scope. It goes all the way from the feed production going into the animal all the way to the feed, all the way to pork delivered to a plate. But sometimes our scope is a little narrower. A cradle to farm gate perspective is only looking at a subset of these components. And so why is this important? Well, these are 3 carbon footprints. These are 3 essentially results of life cycle analyses calculations. These are 3 numbers that on the surface are pretty similar. They're all 3 footprints for swine. They're different though, right? The numbers are different, and why? By understanding not even how the life cycle analysis is done, but just understanding some of those decision points, we can start diving deeper, or at least ask questions when we're presented with numbers. The first 2 numbers, for example, are cradle to farm gate numbers, while the third one is a cradle to plate. One of them is for US-wide. One of them was an analysis just for US Midwest farms, whereas the other one was from Australia. Any calculation, we need to know what are some of those assumptions, what's some of that background to a number, right? Rather than just jumping off with a number. Like I said, it's not necessarily about doing the science, but just being able to ask some of these conversations when numbers come up. Footprints are only one, or life cycle analyses footprints are just one metric. They're just one number. But they're often the one that people will turn to, and the one that people will ask about, or just it's one that has some popularity, I would say, in society. Now, there is no shortage of life cycle analyses studies. Different studies have evaluated past, present, and future scenarios for agricultural industries using various approaches. There was a study done in 2016, and it looked at over 36 different life cycle analyses for the pork industry. Some were focused on feed production. They had a scope of the feed production. Some had a scope of the whole production system, and others really just focused on the waste management or the manure management. It's really about understanding these and recognizing what was their scope, what were their boundaries, that we can really start to look at them. Because it's important to understand what that result really represents, and it's also important when we start to try to make comparisons, right? We want to make sure that we're making valid comparisons or fair comparisons. So like any science, there is some terminology that, and when it comes to LCAs, I think some of this just very basic terminology just enables us to be deeper into conversations when it comes to sustainability. Life cycle assessment considers the life cycle of a product, and there are some standardized methods to it. Allocation is part of a life cycle analysis because many of the products, many of the components of our system serve several purposes. We can allocate what resources are used or what's the impact of a given product based on value, economic value, or mass. The example I like to use from the dairy world is that a cow produces milk, but a cow is also a source of meat. And so how do we allocate the resources used to produce that cow between the different products? Now, impact categories are, in general, with life cycle analyses, they really tend to focus on some global impacts, like global warming potential, eutrophication potential. Ideally, life cycle analyses look at multiple impact categories. Ideally definitely more than one, but ideally more than two even. We want to look at multiple impact categories at once because, as was mentioned earlier, it's a system, right? We don't want to shift burdens, or we're going to be most likely shifting burdens between different impact categories for any decision, for any change. And recognizing what those shifts are is important. And then functional unit, that's what we need to understand if we're going to start down that path of comparing footprints. A functional unit is that description of the function provided by the system. It might be a pound of pork. It might be a certain number of calories. We need to make sure that whenever we are making comparisons that we are using common functional units. Now, those impacts categories that I mentioned, particularly in life cycle analyses, really tend to focus on global dangers. And I've just put up examples here. This is not by any means a full list of either global dangers, regional problems, or local damages. But really, it's a spectrum of impacts that sustainability, or especially on the environmental side, that we're looking at. The spectrum of impacts span multiple scales, both in space and time. Now, the motivation for change can be driven from any one point in this spectrum. We can see analyses undertaken with the idea of understanding, what are the drivers to climate change. On the application side, though, we tend to start at this side, right? How are we preventing some of these local damages, or local benefits for that matter? But what is really that relationship on that spectrum? This middle area can be a little murky. But I think we need to recognize that both motivation and actions can start at any one point in this spectrum. By understanding that it is a spectrum and that there are linkages, that's, again, where we dive into some deeper conversations. There are different LCA approaches. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I've seen some of these words used recently in some sustainability publications. Just making yourself aware of them as well. There are attributional life cycle analyses, which is, I would say, just the resources used or emissions to produce the product or service in question. It's also termed a retrospective analysis. We can have consequential life cycle analyses as well, which are perhaps a little more popular in decision making, but it's about what are the consequences of a change? How are the reverberations of that change going to be felt through the system? More of a prospective approach. Now, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about life cycle analyses, and I say again that they are only one metric, one tool, or one approach to look at where we're at for making an assessment. A life cycle analysis is a detailed science, and it's not feasible for every farm, every organization to necessarily embark on their own analysis. But there are still some tools to just become involved in this conversation, to make some initial assessments, whether it's at a farm level, a barn level, or an organization level. There are different calculators, and I have the pig production environmental footprint calculator in here. I was using one for a while with the help of Pork Board, National Pork Board. It's under development, but there are some of these other tools in there, just even to start understanding the conversation, understanding what are some of the potential points in this discussion. Now, once the group has agreed to head out on a road trip, there still needs to be a general course. There still needs to be a map that's going to be followed, because are going to have to stop at some point. So what's the map? Well, every sustainability journey will have unique twists and turns depending on goals, industry, or farm specifics. A framework is not necessarily the plan. We hear this word framework often. A framework is not necessarily the plan itself, but it's rather the structure for putting the plan together. It's really the map, but the plan is the course on that map that you're going to follow. Another word that I often hear in the sustainability world is initiatives. Initiative is a strategy on how you're going to get from point A to B. We have your underlying framework, but how are we really going to get from that first step, from that first point to the next point? So I may have moved out of my parents' house over 20 years ago, but I know my mom still wants me to call and check in when I'm on a road trip. She wants me to check in every night, just let her know where I got to. Within a journey, within a sustainability journey, we need these checkpoints along the way. We need these checkpoints as places to regroup, refuel, and sometimes explore, frankly, to explore new areas. So these stops, I feel, are analogous to metrics and reporting. We've already seen several great examples of different metric or key performance indicators associated with the pork plans. These are terms, as was mentioned, are not new to the business industry, right? Or to the business side of things. A couple of concepts, though, that from a general sustainability perspective that I think are valuable to note is that with metrics, we can have various metrics feeding together. We can have methane emissions, carbon dioxide emission, nitrous oxide emissions. All of those emissions, though, they carry different weight to them. Luckily, we have some science behind there as to how they can be weighted together to produce one metric. But we don't always have that. And the other concept that we need to keep in mind is that we need more than one metric for an indicator, right? We don't want to bias our results just by focusing on one metric for one indicator. So an example is if we were looking at nitrogen use efficiency as an indicator, understanding what that efficiency is per unit area, per unit yield, or the impact per sector, that gives us a more holistic understanding of where we're at with that nitrogen use efficiency. Then when it comes to the reporting, these report backs, that call back to my mom, for example, it lays out the answers. I think they need to lay out the answers to at least 4 questions, and please excuse the spelling error on here. They need to answer, where are we? Where are we in terms of our key performance indicators? How is the trip going? Provide a report as to where or how the trip is going. What are the metrics that we're using, but also what are the methods that we're using to gather those metrics and report those metrics? Will we get there in time? When will we get there? You know, what is the progress towards our overall goal? But within sustainability plans, there also needs to be some flexibility. There needs to be opportunities to get off course, to adapt along the way when new innovations, new metrics, new approaches come to bear. To be honest, within the sustainability realm, some of the efforts are forging forward, and we don't necessarily have all the metrics in hand to really ascertain what's going on or how well they're happening. We need some more tools to be able to make measurements on farm. We can document changes in actions. For example, for land practices, we can document that we've made a change in how or our tillage practices, but we do lack something to put on our soil to say what's the change been, right? Especially on short term. And so as those types of technologies, as some of these tools have developed, you know, that's going to change our course, and we have to be flexible to those changes. So reporting is a form of sharing. Reports are part of it. Taking the Facebook post, for example, you know, is another part of sharing. What I hear in the sharing story are two different approaches, and both are valid. One of the approaches to sharing is really, where are we? Where are we at right now? The other approach to sharing is, what's this path that we've been on, and what has changed? Both are valid, and both have a place. So really, with sharing, part of that conversation, that's giving us some of this information right here. But now about diving deeper into those conversations. How do we do that? How do we dive deeper into those conversations? Well, to somewhat reiterate what we've been through, we have different metrics. For example, footprints. We have metrics that are provided in these reports. But we also need to have some of the sustainability literacy to go along with it, because we understand what this journey is within our own operation, within our own farm, or within our industry. But we need to recognize that others are on different journeys. Where are they along this journey? What tools, what perspectives, what approaches are they using? And by having some common language, some sustainability literacy, it enables us to dive deeper into those conversations so that ultimately we can find, what are those unifying links? What are those unifying links between our perspectives? What are those unifying links between our approaches? And more importantly, what are those unifying links between our actions? The example I like to use is with the livestock industry. We have manure, right? With the crop industry, that manure is a valuable industry. That manure is a linking piece between, it might be one farm, but it might be two different industries. It might be two different farmers that are sharing that one resource. And so how do we enhance these sustainability conversations between people, between industries, between organizations? So I hope this presentation brings you back to these 3 points, that sustainability is a science, but also a practice. Sustainability has impacts that cross multiple spatial and temporal scales, and understanding that perspective of where someone is coming from or where someone is acting from, I think is what we need to start questioning when we hear stories or when we hear action, but also understanding where we come together. Sustainability perspectives are revealed through these critical conversations. So I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this session and part of this conference, and I hope at some point, if you want to continue the conversation, please give me a call, email, what have you. I'm always interested in talking sustainability efforts.